are you a true Christian? Um, it's a very abstract question because how do you define Christianity? Well, guess what? I'm glad you asked that question. Romans chapter 12, Paul is writing, and Paul kind of tells us the marks of a true Christian, loving, one another, rejoicing with, weeping with, blessing those that persecute you. He has this great list. Read it for yourself. Romans chapter 12. You can kind of check box if you need to write it down and say, do I check these? Do I have the marks of a true Christian? But I want to talk about a subject that this is something that came out of actually my corporate world. When I worked in the corporate world, one of the things that I did was change management, process change management. Excuse me. I'd go into companies and work and help them change process, change how they did things, how they work things through, right? And went through Lean, Six Sigma, if you kind of know that world. And one of the things I recognize is so often individuals would come from different points of views, different perspectives, and so often the problem was them. Someone else was the problem, right? It was the it was the company I was working for was the problem because we were amalgamating another company in, right? It was this department was a problem. And one of the things we would do is we begin to process flow and really figure out where the problem was. But even in that process flow, when we could figure out where the problem was, so often people couldn't see it because they were deceived in what they saw. They were deceived in what they believed, and it became other people's problems. And as I started beginning to create teams, I began to recognize so often, the problem is not in reality, but it's in perception. And in Romans chapter 12, I find this very interesting. Paul says in verse 16, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own eyes. In fact, and then if you go back a little bit to verse 3, it says, by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Recognizing, he says, never be wise in your own eyes. Never be wise, because you've got to recognize that, number one, you don't know everything. Believe it or not, I don't care who you are, how smart you think you are, you don't know everything. Maybe in certain situations, you're the smartest person in the room, but maybe not. In fact, one of my favorite sayings, I wish I could remember who told me this, but when you're in a room with 5 people and you're all speaking, the last one to speak is the smartest. I'm pausing for effect. I want you to think about it. The last one to speak is the smartest. Why? Because he's allowed, or she is allowed, the 4 people before him or her to speak and to give their knowledge on the subject. And if that 5th person, if I'm sitting back and listening and gathering that data, guess what? Now I have actually added their knowledge on the subject to my knowledge. I'm now the smartest person in the room, right? But I wanted to bring, and I've never done this before, but I wanted to bring a couple of books up because I think one of the things that we have to recognize as Christians is far too often we look and we judge other individuals when we're told to judge ourselves. We judge their intentions, we judge their motives, right? We judge even their actions sometimes because it's something that we wouldn't do. But the Bible very clearly is talking about never think of ourselves wiser than anyone else, never to see ourselves higher than everyone else. And there's a couple of good books. This first one is a tale of the 3 kings. And it's a really interesting take. I'm not a huge fan of this book, but I love how it reads, and I love how quick it reads. The basic concept of this book, and again, if the chapter is like a page and a half. I mean, it's really, really short, but it really gets us to think about, it's talking about Saul and David. And to recognize as we look at leaders, as we look at those people in charge, those around us, right? That so often we're judging them through a wrong lens, right? and we're seeing things in them when what we should be doing is looking at ourselves. And the basically the premise of the whole book is that there's a Saul inside of me that I need to kill. There's a King Saul inside of me. Those of you know that King Saul tried to kill David, right? There's a King Saul inside of me that I need to kill, right? The other one, this is one of my favorite books, Leadership and Self-Deception. This book, it's just, to me, is probably one of the most eye-opening books on how I, as a leader, need to make sure that I don't deceive myself, right? How I don't deceive myself in looking at everyone else being the problem, but I ensure that I first look inward to make sure that I'm not the problem. You know, in marriage, in relationships, in everything we do, Christians, listen to this. We have to not be wise in our own eyes. So often we put ourselves, and this is the premise of this book. We put others in boxes, and whether they perform in that box or they go outside of that box, we've already put them in a box, and so we already know how we're going to react in that situation. We already know how we're going to react in that moment. And let me just be super honest here, right? So often, most of our conflicts with people is based on our perception of our what we think they should do. It's this idea that you and I look at someone and say they should act this way, they should have done this. I wouldn't have done it that way. And that's where the conflict becomes, because again, we've thought ourselves wise. We look and say, well, I would have never done that. You were wrong for doing that. But you have no clue, right? We as Christians, we need to look inward instead of looking outward. We need to look inward. Try me, know me, as David would say. See if there be any wicked way in me, God, right? Judge, lest ye be judged. For the same manner that you use, you will be used on you, right? It's not telling us that we should never judge, but it's saying before you judge, make sure you have, and hopefully as a Christian, you're already here with me, make sure you've taken the plank out of your eye before you tell that person about the sliver in their eyes. Christians, do you have the mark of Christianity? Are you wise in your own eyes? Do you love your neighbor? Do you love your enemy? Do you bless those that persecute you, right? Are you a Romans